Take the money, Mr. Walker. Men like you don't get second chances this clean. Paula Grant slid the envelope across the old Ferry desk. $12,000. Cash, no questions. Outside, rain tapped the broken windows of Blue Heron Ferry office. Ranger Ethan's German Shepherd stood between him and the door, silent as a judge. Ethan stared at the logbook, at one name written again and again in faded blue ink. "This building is worthless," Paula said. Ethan slowly closed the book. "No, Mom. People just forgot what it was worth." And that was the moment Havenridge stopped looking away. The duffel bag was not thrown onto the porch. That would have made the hurt easier to understand. It was placed there carefully, almost respectfully, beside Ethan Walker's worn field jacket and the small cardboard box that held everything he had not managed to lose. 3 folded shirts, a shaving kit, a bottle of old aspirin, his discharge papers, a photograph of his father standing in front of a ferry office that no longer existed on any county map, and a brass challenge coin rubbed smooth from years of worry. The morning was gray over Havenridge, Kentucky, the kind of gray that made every house look older than it was. Rain had stopped sometime before dawn, leaving the porch boards dark and slick, and the air smelled of wet leaves, river mud, and coffee someone else had brewed behind a closed kitchen door. Ethan stood at the bottom step with his hands in his coat pockets, looking at the bag as if it belonged to another man. He was 42, broad in the shoulders but thinner than he used to be, with a face that carried its silence in fine lines around the eyes. He had been home from the army for 6 years, long enough for people to stop asking how he was doing, and short enough that he still woke before sunrise expecting orders that would never come. His sister, Mara, had not meant to be cruel. That was the worst part. Cruelty gives a man something to push against. Weariness gives him nothing but an empty room. She had left a note under a coffee mug on the porch rail, the paper trembling slightly in the damp breeze. Ethan read it once. Then again. "I'm sorry. We just can't keep doing this. Please understand." There were no angry words in it, no blame, no accusations, only exhaustion dressed up as apology. From behind the screen door, he could hear the refrigerator humming, a chair scraping softly, life continuing in a house where his space had quietly disappeared. Ranger sat beside him without a sound. The German Shepherd's coat was dark sable, silvered around the muzzle, his ears high but not tense. At 7 years old, he had learned the difference between danger and sorrow, and this was sorrow. He leaned his shoulder into Ethan's leg, a steady pressure, warm through denim, the kind of touch that did not ask for explanation. Ethan looked down and tried to smile. "Looks like it's just us, boy." Ranger blinked once, slow and certain. Ethan had survived desert heat, hospital corridors, paperwork that reduced a life to boxes checked and unchecked, and the long civilian afternoons when nobody needed him for anything. But that morning, what nearly undid him was a duffel bag placed gently on a porch by someone who loved him and still had no room left to carry him. He picked up the bag, slipped the photograph into his breast pocket, and walked toward the cracked sidewalk. Ranger followed for 3 steps, then stopped. Ethan turned. "Come on." The dog did not move. He stood facing the road, then turned his head toward the west, where Havenridge dropped in slow folds toward the Tennessee River. Ethan gave a tired breath. "There's nothing down there anymore." Ranger's ears twitched. The dog stepped forward, caught the loose cuff of Ethan's coat gently between his teeth and tugged once. Not hard, not playful, deliberate. Ethan stared at him. The last time Ranger had done that, it had been to stop him from walking past a stove burner left on in the dark. Before that, it had been during one of Ethan's bad nights, when the room had gone too small and the walls seemed to lean inward. Ranger never pulled without a reason. The wind shifted, carrying the faint smell of the river, cold and brown and older than every road in town. Ethan thought of the photograph in his pocket, of his father in a faded work shirt, one hand resting on the rail of the old Blue Heron Ferry office. Thomas Walker had once said that rivers remembered people better than people remembered each other. Ethan had laughed then, young enough to think memory was something a man could choose to keep or throw away. Now he was not so sure. He reached into his pocket and found $5 folded behind the challenge coin. $5. Not enough for a motel. Not enough for a decent meal if he meant to feed Ranger too. Barely enough to make a man feel foolish for counting it. Down the hill, past the shuttered bait shop and the county road that curved along the bluff, There was a place the town had forgotten on purpose. A ferry office closed since 1996, boarded up after the bridge opened, left to weather and vines and county warnings printed on yellow paper. Ethan had seen the notice once in May Holloway's diner window. Surplus property. Unsafe structure, transfer fee, $5. He had smiled at it then the way a man smiles at something sad he has no power to fix. Ranger tugged again. Ethan looked toward the river, then back at the porch, the note, the bag, the door that would not open unless he knocked. Something in him, small but stubborn, lifted its head. He slid the $5 deeper into his pocket, picked up the duffel, and started walking west with Ranger beside him. Not toward shelter exactly. Not toward hope either. Not yet. Just toward the only place in Havenridge that might understand what it meant to be unwanted and still standing. Long before Havenridge learned to hurry across the new concrete bridge, before the ferry ropes were cut loose and the Blue Heron office was left to swallow dust, Ethan Walker's life had been measured by crossings, not dramatic ones. Not the kind people carve into monuments, just ordinary crossings, from one shore to another, from one shift to the next, from hunger to breakfast, from loneliness to a booth where somebody knew your name. His father, Thomas Walker, had worked the old ferry line for nearly 22 years, a quiet man with square hands, a careful voice, and the habit of listening to weather before answering questions. Thomas did not say much about pride. He showed it in smaller ways. He arrived before dawn. He kept extra gloves by the stove for men who forgot theirs. He learned which widows needed help carrying groceries, and which truckers pretended not to need coffee because they were short on cash. The ferry office, to him, had not been a business. It had been a threshold. Ethan remembered the smell of that place more clearly than he remembered entire years of his life. Black coffee simmering too long, wet wool coats hanging near the stove, river mud drying on boot soles, cedar drawers full of paper tags and brass keys. His mother, June, used to say Thomas loved the river because it never asked a man to explain himself. It simply carried him if he respected it. June was softer than Thomas, but not weaker. She worked the front desk at a small medical clinic on Sycamore Street and had a gift for making tired people lower their shoulders. She could look at a man who had lost work, a woman who had lost patience, an old neighbor who had lost nearly everyone, and speak to them as if loss had not erased their name. From her, Ethan learned that dignity was not something handed out by people in clean offices. It was something you guarded for others when they were too weary to guard it themselves. Maybe that was why he became a medic after enlisting. Not because he was fearless. He never thought of himself that way. Fear had always been part of him, like a second pulse. But he knew how to stay with someone through pain without making them feel small. He knew how to kneel beside a stranger and keep his voice steady. He knew how to say, "I'm here," and mean it. The army gave him structure, then took it away in pieces. Years of service trained his body to move with purpose, but coming home taught him how cruel stillness could be. In uniform, his hands had known what to do. Out of uniform, they hovered over coffee cups, door handles, unpaid bills, the backs of chairs in rooms where conversations ended when he entered. People thanked him for his service with kind eyes and careful distance, as if gratitude were a fence they could place between his life and theirs. Ranger came to him during one of those years when the days looked identical and the nights felt too wide. The dog had been trained with patience, not force, and there was a grave intelligence in him that Ethan recognized immediately. Ranger did not rush affection. He studied first. He watched the tremor in Ethan's fingers when a room grew crowded. He learned the sound of Ethan's breath before a memory pulled him too far inward. He pressed close without pity, which was the only kind of comfort Ethan could accept. After June died, the last soft center of the Walker family seemed to go with her. Ethan moved into Mara's back room for a little while, which stretched into months, then years, then something nobody wanted to name. He fixed what broke. He cleaned gutters, changed oil, patched drywall, kept quiet during dinners, and tried not to take up more space than a folded blanket. Still, a man can make himself small for only so long before he begins to disappear. And perhaps that was why, on the morning the duffel bag waited on the porch, the old river called to him with such strange force. It was not promising rescue. The river had never promised anyone that. It was only reminding him of what Thomas Walker had known, what June had lived, and what Ranger seemed to understand without words. A person is not finished simply because other people no longer know where to put him. Ethan did not leave Mara's house all at once. A man can step off a porch in a single motion, but leaving the last place that knew his mother takes longer than that. It takes the eyes a moment to say goodbye to the chipped blue flower pot June had kept by the railing, empty now except for rainwater and a few brown stems. It takes the hand a moment to hover near the screen door without touching it. It takes the heart, stubborn and embarrassed, a little longer to understand that nobody is coming out to call your name. Behind the glass, the kitchen lights stayed on. Ethan could see the blurred shape of Mara moving from counter to sink, then stopping as if she felt him looking. For 1 second, brother and sister were separated by nothing but a door, a hallway, and every sentence neither of them had known how to say. She had not always been tired. Ethan remembered Mara at 25, laughing barefoot in their mother's yard, hair pinned up with a pencil, promising June that no matter what happened, the Walkers would take care of their own. Life had a way of listening to promises and then testing the bones beneath them. There had been medical bills after June's final winter, a second mortgage Mara never spoke of directly, her husband's hours cut at the mill, and Ethan's quiet presence in the back room becoming, month by month, another weight in a house already leaning. He had tried to be useful. He rose before anyone else, wiped the counters, fixed the leaky sink, cleaned out the gutters, changed the furnace filter, kept Ranger's bowl tucked neatly in the corner so no one would trip over it. He ate last, he showered fast. He folded his blankets with military precision each morning, as though neatness could apologize for need. But need has a sound, even when it is silent. It changes the air in a room. It makes people measure milk before pouring it. It makes conversations stop when bills arrive in the mail. Mara had cried the night before. Ethan knew because the bathroom trash held a crumpled tissue marked with mascara, and because her note had been written in the careful handwriting people use when their hands are shaking. He did not blame her. Blame would have been easier, cleaner, almost comforting. Instead, he felt a sadness so wide it had no clear edge. Ranger stepped onto the porch and sniffed the duffel, then the cardboard box, then Ethan's hand. The dog made a low sound in his throat, not a growl, not a whine, something older than both. Ethan bent and rested his palm against Ranger's head. "She's doing the best she can," he said, though he was not sure whether he meant Mara or himself. The screen door opened 2 inches. Mara stood there in a gray sweater, her face pale, her mouth pressed into a line that tried and failed to be strong. "Ethan," she said. His name came out small. He turned, the duffel strap cutting into his shoulder. "It's all right." She shook her head quickly, as if refusing a kindness she did not deserve. "It isn't." The honesty of that nearly broke him. For a moment, neither moved. Then she held out a paper grocery sack. Inside were 2 apples, half a loaf of bread, a jar of peanut butter, and a small bag of dog biscuits she must have bought for Ranger the week before. Ethan took it with both hands. That was the closest they came to an embrace. "I'm sorry," she whispered. "I know," he said, and he did. That was the hard mercy of it. The door closed softly, not like rejection, more like surrender. Ethan stood there until Ranger nudged his knee. The road ahead was wet and empty, shining under a sky the color of old tin. He looked back once at the house where his mother had spent her last days, where he had tried to become light enough not to burden anyone, and understood with a quiet ache that love did not always mean room. Sometimes love was a grocery sack handed through a half-open door. Sometimes it was letting someone leave before resentment learned their name. He shifted the bag higher on his shoulder, tucked Mara's food beneath his arm, and followed Ranger toward the West Road, carrying no anger, which somehow felt heavier than carrying hate. By the time Ethan reached Mays River Diner, the rain had thinned into a mist so fine it seemed to hang in the air rather than fall from the sky. The diner sat where River Road bent toward the old freight depot, a low brick building with fogged windows, a red neon coffee cup that flickered when the wind blew, and a bell above the door that sounded tired but faithful. Ethan had not planned to stop. Planning required a kind of confidence he no longer possessed. But Ranger paused beneath the awning, shook rain from his coat, and looked through the glass at the warm yellow light inside. Ethan followed his gaze and saw 3 men in work jackets hunched over eggs, a woman counting change at the register, steam rising from a coffee pot like a small weather system of mercy. His stomach tightened. Pride told him to keep walking. The smell of toast told him pride had never fed anybody. He opened the door. The bell gave its weak silver cry, and conversation softened without fully stopping. That was one thing about small towns. They knew how to look without appearing to stare. May Holloway stood behind the counter in a blue apron, her white hair pinned high, her reading glasses hanging from a chain against her chest. She was 67 and built like someone who had carried trays, grief, and other people's secrets for most of her life without asking for applause. She looked at Ethan's duffel, then at Ranger, then at the damp note of weather clinging to his coat. Her face did not change in the way pity changes a face. She simply reached under the counter, pulled out a clean towel, and pointed to the last booth by the window. "Dog dries first," she said. Ethan swallowed something that was not quite a laugh. "I don't have much money, May. Good thing I didn't ask for your financial statement." Ranger walked to the booth with the dignity of a church elder and allowed May to rub the towel over his neck and shoulders. Ethan sat slowly as if the vinyl seat might reject him. May poured coffee into a thick white mug and set it before him. Then came toast, 2 eggs, and a side of sausage wrapped in a napkin for Ranger. Ethan stared at the plate too long. "May, eat before you make gratitude uncomfortable," so he ate not quickly, not greedily, but with the careful attention of a man trying not to reveal how hungry he had become. Outside, River Road shone black with rain, and beyond it the land sloped toward the Tennessee, hidden by sycamores and fog. May leaned against the counter near him, wiping her hands on her apron. "Mara called," she said. Ethan's jaw tightened. She shouldn't have. She was crying too hard to know what she should do. He looked down at his coffee. May's voice softened, but not sweetly. Sweetness would have ruined it. "Needing help doesn't make a man worthless, Ethan. And being unable to carry someone forever doesn't make a woman heartless." He closed his eyes for a second. The sentence entered him quietly, found the place where blame had tried and failed to grow, and sat there like a hand on a fevered brow. Ranger rested his chin on Ethan's boot. May turned an old laptop around on the counter, the screen glowing blue in the dim morning. "County Surplus posted something yesterday. I thought of your father when I saw it." Ethan looked up. On the screen was a grainy photograph of a weather-beaten wooden building half hidden by vines, its sign nearly erased by sun and years. "Blue Heron Ferry office." Ethan felt the room tilt, not much, just enough for memory to spill. He saw his father's hand on the railing, his mother laughing into a paper cup of coffee, himself at 8 years old tracing water stains on the dispatch desk while men in caps argued about river levels. "It's still standing?" he asked. May nodded. "Barely. Closed since '96 after the bridge opened. County wants it gone before summer. Transfer fee is $5. Legal way of saying they'd rather give it away than pay to tear it down." Ethan's hand moved to his pocket, where the folded bill waited behind the challenge coin. May noticed. Of course she noticed. Women like May had survived by noticing what people tried to hide. "It's not livable," she warned. "No power. No water. Roof's bad in the back. Probably raccoons with seniority rights." Ethan almost smiled. Ranger stood then, suddenly alert, and placed one paw on the booth seat beside Ethan, eyes fixed on the photograph. Not begging, not performing, recognizing somehow that the image mattered. May watched the dog, then Ethan. "Some places don't need a buyer," she said. "They need somebody who remembers what they were before the world called them useless." Ethan looked at the building on the screen, then at his dog, then out toward the fog where the river waited unseen but not absent. $5 could not buy safety. It could not buy a future. But maybe, if a man was desperate enough or blessed enough, it could buy a doorway. The Haven Ridge County Administration Building stood 2 blocks from the courthouse, square and beige and deeply uninterested in miracles. Its front steps were damp from the morning mist, and the flag above the entrance hung with the tired weight of wet cloth. Ethan paused outside with Ranger at his side, one hand resting on the folded $5 bill in his pocket as if checking whether it had changed its mind. Across the street, a delivery truck backed into an alley with a long mechanical beep. A woman hurried past under a red umbrella. Somewhere a church bell struck 10, the sound thin and polite in the gray air. Everything about the morning suggested ordinary business. Permits, property taxes, license renewals. Not a man with no address trying to buy a forgotten piece of the river. Ranger looked up at him, patient but firm, the way he looked when Ethan stood too long in doorways. "I know," Ethan murmured. "I'm going." Inside, the building smelled of floor wax, old paper, and coffee that had been sitting on a warmer since sunrise. The walls were lined with framed photographs of ribbon cuttings, county fairs, retired judges, and one aerial shot of the Tennessee River taken in a year when the ferry still ran. Ethan noticed it immediately. The blue heron was a small white shape against brown water, caught forever between banks. He had to look away. At the surplus property desk sat Linda Carver, a woman in her late 50s with silver-threaded brown hair, practical glasses, and the steady expression of someone who had seen enough human trouble to stop being surprised by it. She glanced at Ranger first, then at Ethan's duffel, then at the county listing May had printed for him. "You're here about Blue Heron," she said, not as a question. "Yes, Mom." Linda leaned back slightly. "Most people call to ask whether that listing is a mistake." "Is it?" "No." She opened a file folder, its edges softened from years of being ignored. "Transfer fee is $5. But before you get hopeful, Mr. Walker, you need to understand what you're asking for. The building has no active utilities. The roof over the rear storage room is compromised. The access road washes out in heavy rain. The dock is gone. The county marked it unsafe 3 years ago. We've had 2 raccoons, 1 copperhead, and a volunteer cleanup crew refuse to go back inside." Ethan absorbed each sentence without flinching. He had learned that bad news often became worse if you interrupted it. Linda tapped the file. "It closed in 1996. Nobody has maintained it since. We scheduled demolition for May because, frankly, it's cheaper to erase it than argue about preserving it." The word erase moved through Ethan slowly. He thought of his mother's handwriting on recipe cards, his father's thermos, Mara's half-open door, and the way a person could still be alive while the world quietly removed his place at the table. Ranger shifted beside him and placed one paw lightly on Ethan's boot. Linda noticed that too. "You have somewhere to live?" she asked. Ethan looked at the folder, then at the aerial photograph on the wall. "Not exactly." Her face tightened, but she did not pity him. He appreciated that more than she knew. "I can't certify it as housing. I'm not asking you to. And I can't promise it's worth saving." Ethan gave the faintest smile. Most things worth saving don't come with a promise. For the first time, Linda looked at him not as a case at a counter, but as a man standing at the edge of something. "Why do you want it?" The honest answer rose before he could polish it. "My father worked that ferry. When I was a boy, he used to bring me there before dawn. I thought it was just a building then. Lately I've been thinking maybe some places hold on to people better than people hold on to themselves." The office grew quiet around them. A printer clicked somewhere behind a partition. Linda lowered her eyes to the paperwork, giving him the kindness of not staring. "Your father was Thomas Walker?" Ethan's breath caught. "You knew him?" "My mother did. He waited once in a storm so she could get across after a late hospital shift. Wouldn't take payment." She pulled a stamp from beside her keyboard, then stopped with it hovering over the form. "You understand that once I process this, it's yours. The repairs, the risks, the taxes after the grace period, all of it." Ethan reached into his pocket and took out the $5 bill. It was soft from being folded and unfolded, the corner worn pale. He laid it on the counter with the seriousness of a man placing a stone on a grave. "Yes, Mom." Ranger sat straighter, ears forward, as though witnessing testimony. Linda stamped the page. The sound was small, dry, official. Yet to Ethan it landed like a door unlocking somewhere deep inside the past. She slid the receipt and temporary deed across the counter. "Then I suppose Blue Heron has an owner again." Ethan picked up the papers carefully. His name looked strange beside the property description, almost too large and too fragile at once. Outside, the mist had begun to lift. The river was still hidden beyond town, but he could feel it now. Not calling loudly, not promising comfort, just waiting with the patience of old water. He stepped back onto the sidewalk with Ranger beside him, and the deed tucked inside his coat, near the photograph of his father. $5 had not bought him a home, not yet. It had bought him responsibility, uncertainty, and a building everyone else had written off. But as Ranger leaned against his leg, and the clouds thinned over Haven Ridge, Ethan understood that sometimes a man did not need the world to hand him a future. Sometimes he only needed one small battered door that had not fully closed. The road to Blue Heron had almost disappeared. Ethan found it by memory first, then by the two rusted county markers leaning in the weeds like old men too tired to stand straight. Gravel showed only in patches beneath mats of wet leaves, and young sycamores had pushed their roots into the shoulders of the lane, narrowing it until his borrowed sense of direction felt more useful than the map Linda Carver had printed. Ranger walked ahead on a loose leash, nose low, not pulling now but choosing, which was different. The mist had lifted enough for the Tennessee River to show itself through the trees in brief pewter flashes. It moved without hurry, brown and cold under the late morning light, carrying bits of branch and foam as if it had been entrusted with small messages from every town upstream. Ethan stopped once where the land dipped, and for a moment the sound reached him. Water pressing against stone, wind passing through bare limbs, the faint creak of something old shifting in its sleep. "Well," he said softly, "there you are." The Blue Heron ferry office stood at the edge of the bluff, smaller than memory, and somehow larger because of what time had done to it. The sign above the porch was weather-scoured, the blue paint faded to the color of old milk glass. But if Ethan tilted his head, he could still make out the ghost of the name, Blue Heron Ferry. One corner of the back roof sagged. Vines climbed the siding in black ropes. A sheet of plywood covered one window, while another held a cracked pane that reflected the river in broken pieces. The front steps had warped from years of rain, and the railing leaned outward as if offering its last bit of strength to anyone willing to climb. Ethan stood at the bottom step with the deed folded in his coat pocket. He had expected disappointment, maybe even regret. Instead, he felt the strange embarrassment of being recognized by something that should not have known him. Ranger mounted the first step, paused, and looked back. Ethan tested the board with his boot. It groaned but held. "Easy," he murmured, though he was not sure whether he meant the dog, the building, or himself. The key Linda had given him took patience. The lock resisted, scraped, then turned with a reluctant click. When the door opened, the smell came out in a slow breath: cedar dust, cold ashes, damp paper, mouse nests, river mud, and beneath it all the faintest trace of coffee that could not possibly still be there, and yet was. Ethan did not move for several seconds. Memory entered before he did. His father at the stove, June laughing near the counter. A man in a red cap shaking rain from his sleeves. A ferry horn low over the water, none of it clear enough to trust, all of it strong enough to hurt. Inside, the room waited in gray light. Dust lay over everything with the softness of neglect. A pot-bellied stove sat in the corner, its black iron dulled but not ruined. Two wooden chairs leaned against the wall. A long dispatch desk of dark oak stood beneath the front windows, scarred by rings from coffee mugs and narrow cuts, where someone had once opened envelopes with a pocket knife. On the wall hung a river chart, its edges curled, the old ferry route traced in blue pencil. Ethan ran his fingers over the desk and left 5 clean lines in the dust. "Dad sat here," he whispered. Ranger moved quietly through the room, nails ticking on the floorboards. He sniffed the stove, the legs of the chairs, the baseboards, then stopped near the rear wall, where a faded map of Haven Ridge County hung crooked above a narrow wooden cabinet. The cabinet was so close in color to the paneling that Ethan almost missed it. Ranger did not. He stood before it, ears lifted, head slightly tilted, then raised one paw and touched the lower door. Once. A pause, then again. The sound was soft, but in the empty room it seemed to travel everywhere. Ethan crossed to him. "Find something?" Ranger sat, straight-backed and solemn, eyes fixed on the cabinet. Ethan tried the small brass knob. It did not turn. He checked the edges, found no lock, only swollen wood and time holding tight. He worked his fingers along the frame, gently at first, then, with the careful pressure of a man who had patched enough old houses to know the difference between force and persuasion. The door gave a little, then stuck. Dust drifted down. Ranger's tail moved once against the floor, slow as a metronome. Ethan looked around and found a flathead screwdriver in the desk drawer, rusted but usable. He eased it into the seam and lifted. The cabinet opened with a sigh so human it made him step back. For a moment he saw only darkness. Then the light caught leather, tin, and cream-colored paper sealed with a circle of red wax. Ethan's breath shortened. Ranger lowered himself beside his boot, not triumphant, not excited, simply present. In that small cabinet, behind a map nobody had looked at in years, the Blue Heron had kept its heart. Ethan did not touch the things at first. There are objects a man owns. and there are objects that seem to be waiting for permission from the dead. The leather book lay on the lower shelf, its corners softened, its cover darkened by years of damp air. Beside it sat a navy blue tin box no bigger than a lunch pail, tied shut with a strip of faded canvas. The envelope rested on top, sealed with red wax pressed flat by a thumb long gone from the world. Ranger lowered his head and sniffed once, then backed away and lay beside the dispatch desk, as if he understood this was not a thing to rush. Ethan carried the book to the window where the light was strongest. Dust lifted when he opened it, fine and gray, smelling of paper, river fog, and time. The first page read, Blue Heron Ferry Daily Log 1994-1996. The handwriting was steady, old-fashioned, slightly slanted to the right. Dates marched down the margins. Weather, river height, crossing times, names, notes. At first, Ethan read like a stranger. Fog delay, engine inspection, South Cable Titan, Mrs. Arlen crossed with groceries. No charge. Then the names began to soften into people. A mechanic who brought donuts on Fridays. A nurse who worked double shifts. A farmer who paid in tomatoes one summer when money ran thin. The ferry had not only carried cars, it had carried need, habit, kindness, embarrassment, ordinary courage. Ethan turned another page and the room seemed to lean closer. March 18, 1995. Thomas Walker, 5:12 a.m. crossing. Brought spare gloves for Earl Finch. Refused payment. Ethan's fingers went still. His father's name sat there in blue ink, calm as breath, not carved in stone, not framed on a wall. Just written into a workday by someone who had noticed. He read it again, slower. Thomas Walker. He found the name 9 more times. Thomas staying late for a stranded driver. Thomas fixing a loose rail. Thomas bringing coffee when the office stove failed. Thomas helping a man fill out a county form because the man was ashamed to admit he could not read it well. Ethan pressed his thumb beneath the line until the paper trembled. All his life, he had remembered his father as quiet. The logbook showed him something deeper. Quiet was not absence. Quiet was the shape his father's goodness had taken. Ranger rose and came to him then, resting his muzzle against Ethan's knee. Ethan let his hand fall to the dog's head. He was here, he whispered. His voice broke but gently, like ice loosening at the riverbank. After a while, he untied the canvas strip around the tin box. Inside were neat bundles of bills wrapped in paper bands, a brass ferry whistle, 2 black and white photographs, and a folded note marked in the same careful hand. The money totaled $4,500. Ethan stared at it without joy, at first only disbelief. Money had weight when a man needed it badly. It could feel less like rescue than responsibility. He set it aside and picked up the whistle. It was cold, heavier than it looked, worn where someone's fingers had held it for years. The envelope came last. The wax cracked softly under his thumb. To whoever opens this room after the river goes quiet, it began. The letter was from Arthur Bell, last keeper of the Blue Heron Ferry office. He wrote that when the bridge opened in 1996, people called it progress, and maybe they were right. But he could not bring himself to throw away the records of those who had crossed, when the ferry was the only way over. A ferry office is not just a building, Arthur had written. It is a promise that if a person reaches the bank tired, cold, ashamed, or alone, somebody will help them cross. Ethan read the line 3 times. Outside, a truck rolled over the distant bridge, unseen through the trees. Inside, Ranger sat watching him with amber eyes bright in the dim room. Ethan looked at the money, the logbook, the whistle, and his father's name waiting on the page. He had come to Blue Heron with $5 and nowhere to go. But the room had answered with proof that human worth could survive in ink, in memory, in small acts nobody applauded at the time. And for the first time that day, Ethan did not feel like a man standing at the end of something. He felt like a man being handed the beginning very carefully. By late afternoon, the rain had returned, soft and slanting, tapping against the cracked window panes of the Blue Heron Ferry office, with the patience of someone asking to be let in. Ethan sat at the old dispatch desk with the logbook open before him, the tin box closed again, the brass whistle lying near his hand like a question. Ranger slept under the desk, though not deeply. One ear stayed lifted, tuned to Ethan's breathing. The room had changed since morning, or perhaps Ethan had. Dust still covered the stove, the back roof still sagged. The floor still complained beneath every step. Nothing practical had improved, and yet the office no longer felt abandoned. It felt awake, and that was somehow more frightening. A ruined building asked little from a man. An awakened one asked for loyalty. Ethan counted the money twice, not because he distrusted the amount, but because need can make a man suspicious of mercy. $4,500. Enough to rent a room for a while. Enough to repair his truck if he could convince Mara's husband to let him take it from the garage. Enough to buy dog food, groceries, a phone plan, a few weeks of ordinary breathing. Not enough to rebuild a life, but enough to stop the bleeding around the edges. He touched the paper bands around the bills and felt shame rise in him, quick and hot. Not shame for needing money. May had been right about that. Shame because part of him wanted to close the logbook, sell what could be sold, and walk away before the place asked him to become worthy of it. The first offer came before sunset. Linda Carver must have mentioned the transfer to someone at the county office, and news in Havenridge moved the way river fog moved, quietly, everywhere, impossible to hold back. A local history collector named Dennis Vale called May's Diner, got Ethan's number from a man who had no business giving it, and left a message in a voice polished smooth by money. "Mr. Walker, I understand you may have discovered Ferry records from the Blue Heron line. I'd be prepared to make a fair private offer. $5,000 for the logbook if the condition is decent. More if there are photographs." Ethan listened to the message 3 times. 5,000, more than the tin box. Enough to make the question feel less noble and more cruel. Then, an hour later, a real estate agent drove up the weed-choked lane in a white SUV and stood outside beneath a black umbrella, careful not to step too close to the mud. Her name was Paula Grant. She smiled with professional warmth and looked past Ethan at the bluff. The river view, the bones of the old office. "This could be charming," she said, meaning profitable. "Not as it is, of course, but cleared, rebuilt, marketed properly. Weekend rentals, river heritage branding. People pay for nostalgia when it comes with clean linens." Ethan did not invite her inside. Ranger stood beside him on the porch, quiet as a statue, his gaze steady but not unfriendly. Paula offered $12,000 for the property, cash, closing within 2 weeks. She spoke gently, almost kindly, and that made it harder to dislike her. "You could use a clean start," she said. Ethan looked down at his boots, still damp, still carrying mud from the lane. "Maybe this is one." Her smile faltered just slightly. After she left, the rain deepened. Ethan returned to the desk and sat in the gray light until the words in Arthur Bell's letter blurred. A ferry office is a promise. He wanted to believe that. He also wanted heat, a dry bed, a door that locked, a morning without arithmetic. Outside, cars crossed the modern bridge without slowing, their headlights sliding through the trees in pale streaks. Progress, Arthur had called it, and maybe he had been right not to condemn it. Bridges were useful. They got people across faster. But no one stopped in the middle of a bridge to ask if the person beside them was cold. Ranger rose, stretched, and walked to the logbook. With careful teeth, he picked up the faded canvas strip from the tin box and carried it to Ethan's boot. Then he lay down beneath the photograph of Thomas Walker, his body curved in the shape of belonging. Ethan stared at the dog for a long time. Ranger had never understood money, not really. He understood rooms. He understood whether a man's hands shook less inside them. He understood when Ethan was about to leave a place his soul had not finished entering. Ethan opened the logbook again and found his father's name beneath a note about a late crossing. Waited 7 minutes for Jay Mercer after mill shift. Said no man should watch the river leave without him. Ethan bowed his head. The decision did not arrive like thunder. It arrived like breath returning. Quiet, necessary. He took Dennis Vale's number and wrote, "Not for sale." He took Paula Grant's card and placed it inside the desk drawer, not out of temptation, but as a reminder of the road he had not chosen. Then he unfolded a clean page from Linda's county packet and began a list. Tarp for rear roof, glass for east window, stovepipe inspection, dog food, coffee, broom, lock for front door, chairs. At the bottom, after a long pause, he wrote one more thing: keep the room open. Ranger rested his head on Ethan's boot. The rain kept falling. The building still needed more than he had. So did Ethan. But for the first time in a long while, need did not feel like proof of failure. It felt like the beginning of work. The first thing Ethan bought was not lumber, though the rear roof needed it badly. It was not glass, though the east window let in a blade of cold air sharp enough to make the old papers tremble. It was coffee. 2 large cans of dark roast from the discount shelf at Miller's grocery, a dented kettle from the thrift store, paper cups, and a small handwritten sign he taped inside the front window where the cracked pane caught morning light. Coffee on Sundays, no questions asked. He stood back and looked at the sign for a long time, feeling foolish and exposed. Ranger sat beside him, tail resting against the floorboards, as if foolishness done kindly was still a respectable beginning. The first Sunday nobody came. Ethan brewed coffee anyway, the room filled with that bitter, familiar smell, rising into the rafters, softening the cedar dust and old dampness until Blue Heron seemed to breathe warmer. He swept the floor twice. He wiped the dispatch desk. He read 3 pages of the logbook aloud to Ranger, who listened with the sober patience of a deacon. At 9:30, May Holloway arrived carrying biscuits wrapped in a towel and a jar of blackberry jam. "I don't attend empty rooms," she said, setting them on the desk. "I attend openings." She poured herself coffee, declared it too strong, drank it anyway, and stayed 2 hours. The next week, Linda Carver came with a folder of copied county maps and a box of old Ferry photographs she had found in the records basement. She wore boots instead of office shoes and pretended not to notice the tarp Ethan had stretched over the back room. "Temporary," she said, looking up at it. "Most things are," Ethan answered. By the 3rd Sunday, word had begun to find its way down River Road. Walt Granger, a retired carpenter with bent fingers and a limp from a ladder fall long ago, showed up with a toolbox older than Ethan and said the porch steps were an insult to wood. He replaced 2 boards without asking permission. Roy Dunlap came after him, 81 years old, thin as a fishing pole, wearing a cap that read Blue Heron Line in faded gold thread. He stood in the doorway and removed the cap with both hands. "I thought they tore it down," he whispered. Ethan opened the logbook to 1995 and found Roy's name beside a note about a fog delay and a harmonica tune played while 6 cars waited. Roy laughed once, then covered his mouth as if laughter had surprised him into grief. Ranger walked over and leaned against the old man's knee. Roy put a trembling hand on the dog's head and did not speak for several minutes. After that, people brought things, not valuable things, mostly. A Ferry token, a cracked mug, a photograph of a Buick on the crossing, a wool blanket, a working lamp, a broom, a tin of nails. One woman brought her father's lunch pail and asked if it could sit on the shelf because she had no one left who remembered what his hands looked like when he carried it. Ethan said yes. He said yes carefully, understanding that people were not bringing objects, they were bringing proof. Proof that they had been here. Proof that someone had waited for them. Proof that ordinary lives, if written down and spoken aloud, did not vanish so easily. He painted a new sign on a sanded board diner, the crossing room. Coffee, wreckers, and a chair for anyone needs one. Ranger's place became the patch of sunlight near the door. He greeted everyone the same way. No judgment, no hurry, a quiet sniff, sometimes the gift of his head beneath a waiting hand. Men who had not spoken about loneliness in years talked first to the dog. Women who came only to look at photographs stayed for coffee. Veterans from the county post began stopping by after their meetings, not with speeches or flags, but with work gloves and a willingness to sit near silence without trying to fix it. Ethan learned to let help arrive without apologizing it away. That was harder than roofing, harder than replacing glass, harder than sleeping in the front room with Ranger beside him while rain tested every repair. One afternoon, he watched Walt and Linda argue gently over where to hang the county map, while May washed cups in a plastic basin and Roy told a story about a winter crossing so fogged in that Thomas Walker had guided a frightened driver by walking. Ahead with a lantern, Ethan stood near the stove with the brass whistle in his hand and felt something loosen in his chest. Not happiness exactly. Happiness was too bright a word. This was steadier. A place inside him had stopped bracing for removal. Blue Heron was still rough. The roofline still dipped. The walls still bore stains that no amount of scrubbing would lift. But each Sunday the room filled with names. And every name, spoken with respect, became a plank laid across cold water. By October, the mornings at Blue Heron had learned a rhythm of their own. Ethan woke before the sun, not because sleep had failed him, but because the day had begun to feel worth meeting. He kept a narrow cot in the front room near the stove, folded his blanket with the old habit he no longer used as an apology, and stepped carefully around Ranger, who slept beneath the dispatch desk as if guarding not property, but peace. Outside, the Tennessee River moved through a low silver fog. The modern bridge hummed faintly above the trees, carrying commuters, delivery trucks, and people with somewhere certain to be. Down below, the old ferry office glowed one window at a time as Ethan lit the lamps. He filled the kettle. He measured coffee. He opened the logbook to a clean page he had added after the last original entry, and at the top he wrote the date in steady blue ink, the crossing room Sunday. Weather cool, river calm, coffee ready before first light. He paused, then added, Ranger awake before me. Claims otherwise. The dog lifted his head as if insulted, and Ethan smiled before he could stop himself. It was a small smile, private and unannounced, but it stayed on his face longer than smiles used to. On the shelf above the desk sat Arthur Bell's brass ferry whistle beside Ethan's challenge coin and the faded photograph of Thomas Walker in his work shirt. Ethan had cleaned the frame but not replaced it. He liked the scratches. They told the truth. Things could be worn and still worth holding. At 7:30, May arrived with cinnamon rolls wrapped in foil, complaining that Ethan's coffee was still strong enough to float a horseshoe. Linda came next with a stack of visitor cards she had printed at the county office after hours. Walt brought a repaired chair with one mismatched leg and said anyone who noticed lacked moral character. Roy Dunlap shuffled in wearing his blue heron cap, placed one hand on the doorframe, and whispered his usual greeting to the room before greeting anybody in it. By 8, the kettle hissed, the stove ticked, cups warmed between palms, and Ranger made his slow round from person to person, accepting scratches, secrets, and crumbs with equal dignity. Then Mara came. Ethan saw her through the window before the bell on the door stirred. She stood outside in a tan coat, hands tucked into her sleeves, looking at the sign as if it were written in a language she almost remembered. For a moment, Ethan was back on her porch in February. The wet boards, the duffel bag, the note trembling under the coffee mug. The old hurt rose, but it did not rise alone. With it came understanding, and beneath understanding, something gentler than forgiveness because it had stopped needing a name. Ranger went to the door first. He did not bark. He pressed his nose against the glass. Mara laughed once, softly, through tears she had not yet given herself permission to shed. Ethan opened the door. "Morning," he said. She looked past him at the stove, the maps, the photographs, the people sitting with coffee, as if the place had always been waiting for them. Morning. Her voice shook on the second syllable. May glanced over, understood more than anyone said, and busied herself with cups. Mara stepped inside. Ranger leaned against her knee, and she lowered her hand to his head. "You look good," she said to Ethan. He almost answered with a joke, almost gave away the moment to make it easier. Instead, he let the truth stand. "I'm getting there." Mara nodded, pressing her lips together. She walked to the shelf and looked at the photograph of their father. Her fingers hovered near the frame without touching it. "Mom would have liked this place," she said. Ethan looked around the room. Walt arguing with Roy about whether the ferry ran later on Fridays, Linda pinning a copied map to the wall, May pouring coffee for a man who had come in cold and left his name in the visitor book with careful, embarrassed handwriting. "Yeah," he said. "I think Dad knew it was waiting." Mara turned toward him then, and whatever apology she had carried all the way down River Road stayed behind her eyes. Ethan did not make her speak it. Some crossings did not require a toll. He handed her a cup of coffee. She took it with both hands. Later that morning, when the fog lifted and sunlight reached the old floorboards, Ethan stepped onto the porch with Ranger beside him. The river below moved steadily, asking nothing, remembering everything. He held Arthur's whistle in one hand and his father's coin in the other. He had once believed a man needed a house to have a place in the world. Now he knew a place could be smaller than that. A chair, a cup, a name written down, a dog resting near the door, a room where nobody was treated like the worst day they had survived. Ethan Walker had been 42 when the world quietly set his bag on a porch. He had $5, one tired German shepherd, and nowhere to go. So he bought an abandoned ferry office on the Tennessee River. It was the best $5 he ever spent. If this story touched you, take a moment to like and subscribe so more people can find the crossing room. And tell us in the comments, which moment stayed with you most, and where are you watching from tonight?